Oh, so how soon are you leaving? Wonderful. Right. It should all go well. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Today is, let me just close this window here. Today is Wednesday. It is the 19th of August, and we're getting ready for Parshas Seitzei. And I want to share with you two different Divrei Torah today that relate to Parshas Seitzei. I think each of them has some valuable material in it, but you'll see they're very, very different. The first one we're going to talk about is hanging, and some of the confusion that comes from this. So let's see. The pasuk tells us in Perek Chaf Aleph, that's chapter 21, if a man commits a sin for which he's sentenced to death, and he is put to death, he should be hanged on a tree. It translates here as pole, but literally a tree. Someone might look at this and say, okay, the Torah is sanctioning death by hanging. We're going to see that's not the case. Next one, Chav Gimel, Lo saliniv laso al eitz, and it tells us that after you've hanged the person, don't leave that corpse just on the tree. Ki kavortik baranu bayomahu, he should be buried that very same day. Ki kilas elokim taloi, because hanging a human corpse is a blasphemy to God. V'lo sitameis ad mascha asher Hashem elokecha nasen lecha nachala. And we don't want the land to be defiled, the land that God has given to us as an inheritance. So let's see, we're going to look at the Torah Tamima here. It just quotes some passages from the Gemara about how hanging is to be understood. So this is some Torah Shabbal Peh based on the Masorah that Moshe Rabbeinu explained for us how the Torah's directive are to be understood. Those 40 years in the wilderness, that's what he did. He explained the Torah to us, and then we're going to see what Rambam rules. So let's see. Three passages that the Torah Tamima brings down from the Gemara in Masechah Sanhedrin, which would make sense that this would be found in Sanhedrin, because that's the Masechah that's dealing with the high courts that administered capital punishments. So the first Gemara points out, it's no mistake that the Torah emphasized the word ish in Pasuk Chav Bav. It's that if it's a man who's going to be put to death, again, it's no mistake.
You can adjust
no mistake that the word man was used, and it says as follows. So we're seeing again that the first source in the Torah Tzmima, b'chiyah b'ish chet. If it was a man who has committed a sin that made him worthy of the capital punishment, ha'ish nitle, only men are to be hanged, and meaning what the Torah is speaking about. Veina isha nitles. If a woman was put to death, she is not going to be hanged. Because what did the Torah write? It says v'chi yiyeh b'ish chet. Look at that. It totally took that wrong. It says yachid. It should be yiyeh. Look at that. When you go to Sefaria to take something, it doesn't always get it right. I'm going to correct that on my copy. It says, because the Torah says specifically, it says that if there's a man who was guilty and was given a capital punishment, he is to be hung. Bi'ish v'lo b'isha. The Torah is emphasizing it's not a mistake there. The Torah is being very clear that only men are to be hanged and not women. The commentaries all point out that's just because to save a woman from the embarrassment of her corpse being hanged. It's much more embarrassing for a woman than for a man. So therefore, this whole concept of hanging only applies to men. Next one, v'humas v'tzalusa. Look at the order. First, the person is to be put to death, and then the person is to be hanged. What does that immediately tell us? Is hanging a method of execution? No. This is post-execution. This concept of hanging is basically, again, in a day before cameras, and a day before being able to publicize that someone has been executed. We wanted word to get out because this would be a deterrent for anyone else who may go down that path. So we want to hang in a certain sense to publicize that someone has been put to death. But again, they're not put to death by the hanging. Their corpse is hanged. That's what the Gemara is going to say. But who must? First, they are put to death. The Sanhedrin has Arba Mitzvah space, and they have 4 ways of executing. There's Skila, that's death by stoning, Sreifa, death by burning, there's Hereg, death by sword, and there's Chenek, death by strangulation, but hanging is not one of those. So the first are going to be put to death, then Vitalisa, they're going to be hanged. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Elu, again, that this is a misquote here. They didn't get the word right. Okay, we're gonna have to correct that too. It says ilu ne'emar. It shouldn't be ne'ashar. It should be ne'emar. Ilu ne'emar chet v'talisa. If the order was, if let's say the Torah just says v'chia b'ish chet, and then it says v'talisa, so then it would sound like if a person did something that made them guilty, and then they are hanged. Hayisi omer. Then I would say tolunoso. You hang the person v'achar kach memisunoso, and then you kill him, which is the way that the empires of the world do things, that they kill people via hanging. Achshav, but now that our Torah wrote, Shenemar v'humas v'talisa, that first the person is executed by Beis Din and then they're hanged, what does that clearly teach us? Mimisinoso, that Beis Din first kills the person who is, again, this is very rare that someone's going to meet all the criteria to be put to death by the capital punishments that the Torah speaks about, but they're first killed, the achar kach tolanoso, and only then are they hanged. So again, death by hanging does not exist in the Torah. When the Torah is speaking about hanging, it's talking about a display of the corpse. And we'll soon see for just how long that was. One more quote from the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Vitalisa, and the person is to be hanged. Again, what does this look like? There's no such concept as a noose around the neck. Ketzad Talanoso, how is this man who was executed by Beis Din to be hanged? Mashkin es hakora baretz, a beam is sunken deep into the earth. And then there's a perpendicular branch or a perpendicular beam, like at a right angle, yotze mimena, that emerges out of that. Umakiv shtei yadav, they would bind together the corpse's two hands, ze al gav ze, one on top of the other, vitoloso, and the person would be hanged just hanging by those hands. That's it. He's not nailed to this tree. He's not. His hands are tied together. Again, I'm just doing this as a symbolism, but God forbid this isn't talking about us. So again, his hands are put together and then they're put over that beam, and that's how the person's hanging, just from the hands. That's
Why would they do that?
What?
Why would they hang him on a tree?
Oh, again,
He's already dead. You want to publicize? Take his picture.
There's no picture at the time of the Torah. So again, the whole concept.
I'm being facetious.
Yes, I'm saying. We're going to see the
Rambam.
Rambam. It's going to be very clear. The whole point was to be a public display. Again, you have a crowd standing around. Not everyone is going to see this corpse, but if the corpse is elevated, brought above the crowd, a larger crowd could see, yes, someone has been executed, and now this is a deterrent for anyone to follow down this person's path.
I'm not sure how much halacha is in when you do Torah. Be very, very careful.
Again, this is specifically talking about someone who was executed under those very, very rare circumstances where a Beis Din would execute someone. And we're going to see from Rambam that this was only someone who was executed for skila. So there was specific crimes that would have fit this bill here. Let's say public desecration of Shabbos could have been one of them. A blasphemer could have been one of them. So these are very, very few and far between. And again, we're going to see that it's for a very short period of time that this person is to be hung like this, and then the person is going to receive kvura b'karka. I just want to point out the whole source in the Torah of kvura b'karka, that a Jew is supposed to be buried in the ground, comes from where? This pasuk. If this is the way we're treating a criminal who is guilty of those rare crimes and put to death, what does that tell us about how the average Jew is to be treated? Kol sheken, they're supposed to be treated with dignity, respect, and be buried in the ground. This is how a convicted convict criminal is to be treated. Right? What did the pasuk say in Chav Gimel? It says, "Ki kavor tikbarenu bayomahu." He should certainly be buried on that day. We're talking about a convicted criminal who was executed for a capital offense. That's the source of how we know every Jew is supposed to be buried in a hasty manner. So if that was true of the criminal, kol sheken, certainly that's true for every Jew who was not guilty of anything like this. Let's see Rambam. Rambam's going to round out a couple more details for us. Bottom of page 1. This is found in his Mishnah Torah about the laws in Sanhedrin. It says, Ketzad mitzvah sanitlan. What does it look like, this mitzvah in the Torah of hanging someone? After a person has been stoned to death. So again, here it looks like Rambam is saying the only ones, it's limited, not to anyone. Again, we said there were 4 methods of execution based on various crimes. It seems like Rambam is learning that this is only for someone who was killed by stoning. So you'd have to look up what death penalties in the Torah warranted death by stoning. So after this person has been killed by stoning, so mashkin es hakor ba'aretz. So like the Gemara says, a tree or a beam is sunk into the earth, right? So it's a metal perpendicular beam comes out of that branch or that post rather. Umakifin shtei yadav zo al zo, and the two hands of the corpse are intercrossed one on top of the other, and they're tied that way. V'toleu samuch l'shkia zechama, and we hang this person up on the beam as close to shkia as possible, as close to sunset as possible. And we take him down almost immediately. So this is
barely shown.
Correct. So it sounds like the Masorah we have, Torah Shabbal Peh, is, yes, this is a requirement, but we want to minimize it as much as possible. Why? Because as the Torah itself writes, Kilulas Hashem Taloi, it's a blasphemy to God for a human corpse who's created in the image of God, even a criminal like this, to be hanging like this. So we've got to get it done, but they would wait till it's close to Shkia as possible, so it's done as little time as possible. V'imlan, and if we would let this person stay this way for a while, over and above below saseh, we will have violated a negative command in the Torah. Shenemar lo salin if it's because the Torah specifically says we're not allowed to let a corpse stay on the tree. That is what we clearly have. So the Torah is telling us that there's this idea of taliyah, idea of hanging, but it's abundantly clear from the Gemara, from our Torah Shabbal Peh, and how you see a Rambam codifies this. This is not talking about death by hanging, and what it's talking about is displaying a corpse of specific criminals who have been executed in a specific manner, and it's for a very, very short amount of time. Let's look at Rav Sorotzkin. Rav Sorotzkin offers us here two interesting ideas why it might be that the Torah, when it speaks about chenek, when it gives us that, we said based on its four ways of executing, one of them is chenek, death by strangulation. Someone may have posited, okay, well that's simply hanging as we know it, but that's not the case from the Gemara. The Gemara makes it very clear. Chenek, we're going to see what that consists of. But death by strangulation, it was not hanging. And the Rav Sorotzkin is going to offer us two suggestions, perhaps, as to why the Torah was very against death by hanging. Let's see. V'humas v'talisa, we're on page 2. So he's going on the pasuk that says, first the person should be executed, and then he should be hanged. Yachol yeh tolan sochai. The Gemara says, I would have thought that this person should be hanged while he's alive, meaning death by hanging. Talmud Lomar, that's why the pasuk is very clear. V'humas, first the person is executed, and then v'tali so Sifri. He's quoting the Sifri, but that's the same Gemara that we saw as well. Hainu, what's the Gemara? What's the Medrash and the Gemara clearly teaching us? Shelo yamisu asamechuyav chenek al yidei tliya. The method of the means of execution of chenek, of strangulation, is not to be carried out by death by hanging. That's clear. That's what the Gemara and that's what the Sifri, the Medrash, are telling us from this pasuk. But who must? The person's first supposed to be executed and then they're supposed to be hung. Don't confuse this with death by hanging. Lomi boy al yidei tliya biyadayim u'kaminag habarbarium uchenemar sarim biyadam nitlu. So he says, not only is the Torah coming to tell us, according to the Gemara and the Medrash are saying, not only is the Gemara coming to tell us that we don't strangle a person with our own hands, and he says that's the way the barbarians would do it. And he says, you'll find this in Eicha. It says there, Sarim biyadam nitlu, is that some of the officers of our oppressors, biyadam, with their own hands, nitlu, they strangled people. V'anidon misabek im mar hamaves yamim rabim. And what you can also have, if let's say someone is death by hanging, and meaning they were, let's say, the way the Romans would do it, whether, we think of being nailed to a cross, sometimes they would just tie a person to a cross, and sometimes they would tie people up like that and just leave them like that. The way a person died, it could be days, just lying there exposed to the elements, or the way it would work is that the body naturally, after a certain way, it ends up basically suffocating itself, being in that position and sinking down and the muscles contracting to make it that the lungs can't expand. It's an absolutely miserable way to die. And the Romans were very into this. They were also into impaling people. This was very, very common practice in the ancient world. And again, the goal of this was to make a spectacle of the person, to make an example for the rest of everyone who was around, and it was to make it a long, miserable, bitter death, to make it a horrifying experience, and this would really be a deterrent. So this was what the barbarians of the world, again, first ones was by hand, and then later the Romans and others would put people on crosses and kill them this way. This is something that has no tinge of Judaism to it. Anidon, the one who was judged to be killed in this matter, Misabeki Mar Mavas, would struggle with the misery, agony of death, Yamim Rabim, could go on for days on end. There's no way to kill that's more cruel than this. In other words, that ancient method of execution, of crucifying, putting up on, again, it didn't have to be with nails, it could have been tying to a cross. That was absolutely miserable and absolutely abhorrent. But even the Torah is coming to tell us, don't do death by hanging, even in a more civilized form of hanging. Al yidei chevel b'tzavaro, with a rope around a neck, talo yalaetz, and then hanging someone on a tree. Don't kill that way. Kiminag hagoyim haneurim, which is the way of the enlightened nations around us. In other words, modern day, we look to say, oh my God, we would never do what the Romans did. That was awful. We would never impale people. That's disgusting. That's awful. We'll do it a much more humane way. We'll put a hangman's noose and we'll we'll execute them that way. By the way, just look at that word. I had to look this up just to make sure I was reading this right. Kiminag hagoyim haneurim, like the methods of the nations. Haneurim means, I translated it as enlightened, but what does that literally mean? If someone is woken up from their slumber, it means they were, think about it, it's in Shir Hashini, Yashim Libi air. In order to be woken up, Haneurim, who are awoken. So it almost sounds like the word woke here, but it basically means enlightened. Those who have been awoken from the slumber of the dark ages. So he says they hang with a noose around a neck. That clearly the Torah says is not what's going on here. Asra Torah. The Torah says no, that's not misa of chenek. So the Gemara makes it very clear to us, and the Mishnah as well. What does it look like when the Torah says chenek? A person is buried in trash until their knees, just in earth until their knees, to basically meaning that they can't move. They're kind of like in their knees, they're in place. They would first wrap around the person's neck a very, very soft, like silky material, so he wouldn't feel the friction of anything. And then inside that, they would put a much more a coarse material. The Korach al Tzavaro Zeh Moshe Chetzlo V'Zeh Moshe Chetzlo Ad Shenav Tzitzis. And then the two executioners of Basin would pull on either side on that very rough material until the person died of strangulation. Again, very few and far between, but that's what chenek looks like according the Torah's means of execution. Nothing with what we think of in terms of either crucifying or being impaled, and not a hangman's noose. Okay. So now he wants to offer two theories as to why is it that the Torah would say, why did Judaism reject that means of execution? Nearly tam lazeh. So he says, I want to suggest perhaps reason number one. Why is it, number one, why we don't kill people? Why doesn't Basin kill people with the hangman's noose? So here's the first reason. When someone is put to death, who memis es atzmo, in a certain sense, the victim is killing themselves because it's the person's own weight and that inertia of them falling that is basically going to cause the death. Shegufo machbir ala chevel, the person's weight is going to tug on that rope, and the person's going to be killed in that fashion, be choked to death or have his neck broken on that fashion. And that would go against Jewish principles for two reasons. Aleph, shehuma abedas atzmo, in a certain sense, that's almost like we're compelling the person to commit suicide, in a sense. Since it's the person's own weight that's being used against them, if, let's say, we would put someone on a hangman's noose and kick away the chair or pull a trapdoor so the floor pulls out from under them, in a certain sense, we're using the person's own physical being to cause their own death. And what do we know? Mitzvah's chenek tzricha liyos al yidei edem. The mitzvah of chenek, the death by strangulation, it's supposed to be carried out by who are the executioners? The Edom, those witnesses who came to court and testified that this person had committed a crime that's worthy of chenek. They're the ones who the Torah basically says, which again, some theorize that by not having some anonymous executioner, we're kind of making it tougher on those Edom to give false testimony at someone. Oh yeah, you want to report this about someone? Just understand who's going to carry this out. You really sure? So it makes sure that these people are being honest here. But it's very clear in the Gemara that it's the Edom who are supposed to carry this out. And if it's the person's own body weight, the force of their own weight and gravity working against it, it's like we're using the person himself. We're not using those Edom. That's the first reason. And Bays, what's the second reason why halacha would not sanction death by a hangman's noose? Einonu rishon lidrosh me'anidon. It's not fair of us to ask from the one who was judged, shehu yisayeya begufo uvemamono larigaso, that he should contribute towards his own death using his own body or his own money. V'chein amrin and Chazal, and this is what Chazal teach us in Sanhedrin, Evan sheniskaba, and let's say death by stoning, the stones that are going to be used, or eitz shenitlabo, or the tree that's going to be used to hang the corpse, sayef sheneragbo, or the sword that's going to be used in the death by sword, or the cloth that's going to be used for death by strangulation, kulan mishal tzibor. Those have to be bought by the community, because it would be cruel and unjust to ask the person who's already going to be executed that they should contribute towards their own death. So let's say this person owned a rock quarry, and he's got tons of rocks. Why should we go out and buy rocks? This guy's got tons for death by stoning. No, that's not fair to ask this person. Let's say this guy had a fabric business, so he's got all the fabric. We got to go out, Basin has to invest in cloth to kill this guy. Yes, it's not fair to ask the person, he's got a sword, we have to have our own sword. Yes, because it's not fair to ask this person. My taima the mididei lo amrinan le zil v'laise v'liktol navshe. The Gemara says we would never say to a person that's like cruel and unusual punishment that they have to use their own resources to provide for their own death. So v'hachinami yafshal ishtamish b'choved gufo kedei liktol navshe. So by death by hanging is depending on the person's own body and their own weight to cause their death. That would seem to violate this principle. Okay, so we have here is Rav Sorotzkin offering two theories. We don't know. These are Tamei Amitzos. We don't know. But he's offering two theories as to why is it that when the Torah speaks of chenek, and this one of the methods of execution that Beis Din has, it's going to be chenek, it's going to be strangulation. It clearly was not death by hanging. And that's what he points out here. Okay, so we have it very clear. Excuse me, when the Torah speaks of hanging, it's after the person has been executed. We saw the Gemara gave all sorts of criteria for this. It definitely was not death by hanging. Rav Sorotzkin gives two reasons why. When I saw this week, my mind first went to think of the following idea. Anyone know how many times in the modern day state of Israel, how many times has Israel actually carried out, meaning based on a courtroom, carried out the death penalty? Once. And that was for who? Adolf Eichmann. In 1962, that's when he was found guilty, he was sentenced to death, and he was actually executed. And by the way, there's fascinating articles that are out there. For years, his identity was kept secret, but it was publicized really after he died. Who was it who actually was the executioner? Was a Yemenite Jew who was living in Israel. And I've seen interviews where he explained exactly what went on and exactly what the execution consisted of. How they did everything in the legal, everything was documented. But he said something fascinating. When they were appointing guards to guard Eichmann throughout his trial and after he was found guilty through the appeals process and everything, they specifically took Sfardim. They did not want Ashkenazim. What's the reason why? Why do you think?
Because they would have been afraid that the Ashkenazim might have attacked him.
Exactly. Chances were, this is just a little less than a decade after the Holocaust, every Ashkenazi living in Israel had skin in the game, had dear family members who were lost, could have been parents, could have been children, siblings who were lost to the Nazis, and they were very nervous. They wanted to have justice play itself out. They didn't want to have vigilante justice, so they were very nervous that all you needed was somebody to take the law into their own hands, and they wanted to make a very clear example to the world of what had happened here, and that could have all backfired. So they found a team of Sfardim to basically guard him, and I saw one interview where he says this wasn't even fully explained to the guards why they were specifically chosen. So there was one night where either he chose to trade positions with somebody else, and there was an Ashkenazi guy who basically was a Holocaust survivor himself, who had tattooed numbers on his arms, and went to Eichmann's cell and basically was harassing him in the window, showing him look what's on my arm, buddy. Like, look how karma works, and who's behind now, and got him all rattled. So Eichmann started going nuts, yelling at him in German until other guards came out, to separate them. But he goes, it only became clear after that incident that it was no coincidence what had happened. Anyhow, this fellow died a couple years ago, and I've seen interviews where he gives an absolute full account of what went on. How was Eichmann executed? The hangman's noose. So Eichmann definitely was executed with the hangman's noose, and the account was he pulled a lever. There were special gallows that were built for this. They specifically did not want to just reuse the British gallows. Again, the British were notorious for hanging during mandatory Palestine when they were in charge. They were notorious for hanging tons of Jewish fighters. Anyone who was they thought was violating their edicts, and the method of execution was death by hanging. I think in modern Hebrew, the gallows is called the gardom. So there are people who they were referred to as ma'alei hagardom, those who ascended the gallows, meaning who went up to be executed by the Brits. So they did not want to use the ones that had been used by the British. They wanted to make one that was specifically just for Eichmann for this one purpose, and they assembled that. And there was a trap door. This Yemenite Jew, pulled the lever. He collapsed, and based on his own weight, that's how he died. They left him there for a good while to make certain that he was dead, and that's how he's done. So my thought process went after just seeing this. I was just very curious. Not whether I know there was a debate at the time when the trial went on and when he was sentenced to death. There was some debate at the time about whether or not Israel should carry out the death penalty. And in fact, there were people who submitted letters, appeals for clemency to the president of Israel at the time. They were all rejected, and he was executed. Some of those appeals were people who were Beshita, just always against the death penalty, say, what'll that do to us? It'll make us subhuman. Why do we want to do that? Just let this person rot in jail, and God will sort him out. Others were very adamant that, no, this is, the blood of 6 million demands justice here. Interestingly, what I found was there were some people who were making the argument, very similar argument to those who were arguing against taking any kind of German reparations. We didn't want to give the impression as if, okay, now the score has been settled and history has been righted. So the same way people were arguing about accepting German reparations, that, okay, now they've atoned for what they've done. Maybe now that we got Eichmann and we hanged one of the biggest architects of the final solution, now history has been right. They don't want to give that impression. So you're going to see one of the names that's going to come up here was Martin Buber or Buber. Different people pronounce his name different. He was one of the people who was advocating for not killing him, and it wasn't because he thought he was innocent, and it wasn't because that he was, let's say, Beshita against the death penalty. His argument, from what I read, seems to have been that he didn't want to give the impression that now Germany was absolved and now we can just march along. Okay, be that as it may. But my question was, I understand that there were people who were against the concept of a death penalty. My question was, in the camp of people who were fine with the death penalty, was there anyone at that time who said, if you're going to kill him, don't kill him by hanging, because we have a very, very long Jewish tradition that death by hanging is not a Jewish thing, coming back to this pasuk in the Torah. So I was doing some research this week just to see, did anything of this nature exist? Let me share with you two things I found. So here's a JTA article on the bottom of page 2 from when he was actually executed. We're not going to see the whole article, just these two paragraphs. So this is, you see the date, June 1st, 1962. Adolf Eichmann was hanged at Ramla prison early this morning. Again, they specifically didn't do it in Jerusalem. They didn't do it at the British compound. Friday, the trap was sprung a few minutes after midnight, Israel time, 6 p.m. New York time. The execution of Eichmann marks the first hanging of a criminal in the state of Israel, and none has taken place since then. There's been debate in the last year or two after October 7th if they want to, do this for a terrorist, but nothing's taken place since then. Where there's no capital punishment except for crimes committed against Jewish people. But again, it hadn't been carried out until Eichmann. It hasn't been carried out since. The execution came swiftly after the rejection of clemency appeal by the president. That doesn't mean the president put the appeal. The president was the one who rejected it. That's what it means. The rejection was communicated by the president's office to the Ministry of Justice, from there to the administration of the prison, where Eichmann was awaiting a last word. Prior to his rejection of the Eichmann's appeal for clemency, President Ben-Zvi received appeals also from a number of Israeli intellectuals, including Professor Martin Buber of the Hebrew University. Again, from everything I read, Buber's appeal was just, we don't want to give the impression that now the score has been settled, urging him to spare Eichmann's life. On the other hand, the president was flooded with letters and other messages requesting him to stand firm by the ruling of the tribunal, which sentenced Eichmann to death, and that's in fact what happened. Again, I was searching, was there anyone who really had a problem with hanging? And here's the closest I found. Let's go to page 3. Page 3, this is a New York Times article. Again, this is before the execution. He was executed in June of 1962. This is after the verdict comes out. So you see, justice, it wasn't just overnight he was killed. This is in December when he was, the verdict was given. He's not executed until June 1st. So let's see what happens here. This is a New York Times article, just the beginning and end. Rabbinical law cited on penalty. It justifies Eichmann doom, religion minister says. So Jerusalem, December 15th, the death sentence meted out to Adolf Eichmann today was in keeping with Jewish religious law, according to Dr. Zerach Warhaftig, Israel's Minister of Religious Affairs. The special court that tried the former Nazi official sentenced him to death for crimes against the Jewish people, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Dr. Warhaftig, who gave his views privately before sentence was pronounced, said that from the study of the halachot, he had arrived at the conclusion that the sentence must be death. Last paragraph. Dr. Warhaftig said he would object. He said he would object to an execution in Jerusalem because the city is regarded as holy. So that's why he was eventually executed in Ramla, not in Jerusalem. He also said that he had favored shooting as method of execution when the subject was considered in the Knesset shortly before the trial, but that a majority had voted for hanging as the method of execution in laws where the death penalty is prescribed. So you see here, Dr. Warhaftig was a very religious man. He was against hanging. I don't know what the reason was. I don't know if it was just what we raised, because the Torah says death by hanging wasn't a thing. Well, the Torah also doesn't say death by firing squad is a thing. So I don't know what his objection. I couldn't find anything. What exactly his objection was, and I would be curious to find it out. I just, my research wasn't able to turn anything up on that. Nonetheless, you see that there was some discussion about what method of execution should be used. He was outvoted, and that's that. Now the question is, why was hanging used? I've seen two theories. One theory that was out there, actually I should say two rabbis suggested to me two theories. One rabbi local, who you know, is Rabbi Joel Finkelstein. So I was in touch with him about this because I had posted this question to a rabbinic email group I belong to, and he reached out to me and said, for all you know, this was still on the books from British mandatory Palestine. The way the British executed, the only means of British execution during the whole mandatory Palestine period was hanging. So for all you know, the court system in Israel, when it assumed it was, okay, the British left, we're taking control of our own country, we're taking control of our own destiny, maybe that just stayed on the books because that's what was used, and, the legal system that may have been set up was based on the British method. He says maybe that's it. Another rabbi that I know emailed me, says his theory was, you have to remember, this is several years after the Nuremberg trials. How were all of the architects of the final solution executed at the Nuremberg trials? They were hanged. The primary ones were hanged. So maybe this is the same thing. Maybe they just viewed this as an extension, so to say, continuing of the, had Eichmann been found and been brought to the Nuremberg trials, he would have received death by hanging there. We're going to continue that work. So I don't know. I don't know why it was that hanging was the method that was used. But even in the current discussions that are underway, whether or not to bring back the death penalty for convicted terrorists, they're talking about hanging. That is the one that's there. And again, I just haven't seen anyone raise the discussion saying, but again, I understand why not, because again, we're working outside the Torah system. There's not a Sanhedrin. There's not, so we're not working in that system. Once we're not working in that system, if the shooting firing squad is permitted, why isn't this permitted? I was just curious whether or not there was almost like a hang up on hanging. That there was a reluctance to get involved with hanging, because it is the closest thing I found was from Dr. Warhaftig, and I can't say for certain that.
It's incumbent upon Jews not to hang Jews.
Yeah.
But is it incumbent upon Jews not to hang non-Jews?
Well, we don't know. The only time the Torah even discusses execution is in the context of the Sanhedrin. Once we're outside the Sanhedrin, So in other words, but this whole idea of hanging like it almost seems anathema to that's what I was just curious. Like, was anyone bothered by this? I'm not saying I'm bothered by this. I'm just curious if this was a concern, and I wasn't able to to find the
like the way they put people to death in the United States now. I mean, they don't do the election.
Right.
They don't do that. They don't. I mean, they stop the heart.
Yeah, but some of those have been colossal mess ups too. You sometimes hear these accounts about how they didn't administer enough or it wasn't done right. Again, when they were using the electric chair, there were awful stories about. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it definitely seems by lethal injection. Lethal injection could be yeah. Definitely. Yeah, definitely seems that's probably why, in the United States, most states have moved in that direction, Okay, let's go to a totally different Dvar Torah, and this one is on a better topic, So let's see, totally different Dvar Torah. So we're on page 3. So the Torah is telling us our responsibilities of Hashavas Aveda, returning lost objects. And it says as follows: L'sira shor achicha eseo nidachim v'salamta mehem. I shouldn't see my brother's ox or sheep straying and ignore them. Hashev tishiveim lachicha. Return them. Hashavas Aveda. If the guy who owns it is not close by, or below Yadato, or you just don't know whose it is, but I know this is Eretz Yisrael. I know it's a Jew who owns a sheep. Okay, so take it in and take care of it. Until you find out. You see the ad in the paper saying, hey, I'm missing a sheep and I can't find it. Okay, so feed it, take care of it until you can find the owner. Gimel, v'chein tasal chamaro. That's not limited to sheep. That's also for his donkey. V'chein tasal simlaso. That's also for his garment. You find a sweatshirt, and until you find it, hang on to it until you can find the owner. V'chein tasal chol aveda sochicha asher tavad mimenu matzasa. Do this for anything that your friend loses and you find it. Lo tuchali salem. You can't just turn a blind eye to stuff. One more dalit. Lo tiras chamor achicha or shor neflim b'derech. If I see my friend's donkey or ox and they're just burdened down under a really weighty load on the road, I shouldn't just turn a blind eye. I should join in to try to help that guy lift up and get that ox or donkey back on its feet. Let's contrast this to Shemos. In Shemos, in Parshas Mishpatim, the Torah clearly says there, Kisifka shor oyivcha, if I encounter the shore, the ox of my enemy, o chamaro, or the donkey of my enemy, toeh, and it is straying off, Hashev Tishiveno, return it to them. So the way the Torah phrases it in Mishpatim, when it's talking about Hashavas Aveda, about my friends, about another Jew's animal, is the donkey or the ox of my enemy. Here, it doesn't phrase it that way. Here, it phrases it as Achicha, my brother. It's a much closer bond. So we're going to see two commentaries that take up on this. What happened? Why the change in tone? In Mishpatim, it's phrased as it's my enemy, and here it's my brother. I'm going to give him a bro hug. I'm about to fist bump him. That's what it sounds like here. There's some level of closeness. So we're going to see two very different explanations. Explanation number one is the Meshech Chachma, whose 100th yahrzeit was, I believe, this was it 2 days ago? I think it may have been 2 days ago. It was within the last couple of days. One second. Anyone know what is the Hebrew date today? Yeah.
It's like
Elul was the first of Elul was Friday. Yeah, so I believe it was. I think is yahrzeit. If I'm correct, I saw someone say that it was the 17th. Correct. So it would have been the 17th of August. So that would have been 2 days ago. Yeah. So 2 days ago, so would have been what, the 3rd of Elul? 4th of Elul. Okay. So I saw something, just an article I was just reading, I think earlier this morning, that is 100th anniversary. So this is, look, Min HaShamayim, that we're seeing something from the Meshech Chachma. Should be an aliyah for his lofty neshama. So Rav Meir Simcha HaKohen of Devinsk, he makes note of this, and look what he says. He offers such a beautiful explanation. Why was it in Mishpatim, when we're referring to this, he referred to the donkey or the ox of my enemy, and here it's talking about the donkey or the ox of my friend and my brother. And we're not going to read him inside for interest of time because I want to get the second one, but we're going to speak him outside. The Meshech Chachma says, chronologically, what big event happened in between Mishpatim and now? the chet ha'egel, the sin of the golden calf, happens after Mishpatim. So he says, the first time we see this idea, that's before the chet ha'egel, before all of the Jewish people, except for Shevet Levi, before all of us as a people sinned in the chet ha'egel, that's where the Torah says, if I see the shor or chamor, the ox or the donkey of my enemy, I've got to return it. The Gemara says, why is it referring to an enemy? How are any of us allowed to have an enemy? The Torah says, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha." How am I allowed to have an enemy? So the Gemara says that's talking about someone who I see is a willful violator of the Torah. If I see someone who's, let's say, Machal Shabbos b'Parshas, he knows better, she knows better, and they still are saying, I'm going to be violating the Sabbath, and I'm doing it in a public fashion, I'm allowed to have an element of hate towards that person because they should be acting better, and this is what they're doing. There should be there's room for some type of hatred. So the Meshech Chachma wants to say like this: in Mishpatim, which is before the incident of the golden calf, there it's possible for the Torah to speak about coming upon or witnessing the shor or chamor of oivecha, of my enemy, because I'm allowed to have an enemy. But after the ego, where every single one of us are knee deep in sin, none of us can say that as pearly white as as snow, and I'm as innocent as and as clean. I've done nothing wrong in life. Once we as a nation sinned with that, what right do we have to hate another Jew? Another Jew might be sinning, but what? We're so much better. Our ancestors, we're all involved with the Chet HaEgel. We're right. So license was taken away from us to ever fall into that category of having a yivcha that's sanctioned by the Torah. Another Jew that I could say I'm allowed to hate that Jew. We don't have that anymore. Post Chet HaEgel, where none of us are perfect, it's all about Avas Yisrael. It's all about finding ways to love our fellow Jew. We don't have a right to hate any Jew anymore because none of us are perfect. I thought that's such an interesting idea what the Meshech Chachma is saying there. So he says that's a contrast. Mishpatim, which is before the Chet HaEgel, there the Torah could phrase it that way. Ki sifka shor oyivcha chamaro toeh hashev teshivalo. But now in Devarim, which is post the Chet HaEgel, when the Torah is reminding us of the laws of Hashavas Aveda, he's not going to talk about that. It's our enemy's donkey, our enemy's ox. Who's allowed to have an enemy? We're all achicha. We're all brothers. We're all sisters. There's no such thing as that. I'm not allowed to relate to another Jew that way because I'm no better. Who says I'm any better? Yeah, before the Chet HaEgel, I may have said that I'm pure, I'm innocent. After the Chet HaEgel, we're all dealing with our own skeletons in our closets. None of us have a right to hate another Jew. We should be finding ways to, we could disagree, but we should be finding ways to build bridges, and we should be finding ways to say, how can I exercise Avas Yisrael? I thought that's a fascinating Dvar Torah. I think that's beautiful, and what's something beautiful idea to learn on his Yortzeit. I want to share with you another answer to this, and this second one is absolutely beautiful. And this is Rabbeinu Bachya. Rabbeinu Bachya is one of our great Rishonim to the Torah, and Rabbeinu Bachya is bothered by this also. Look what he answers here. He says, Lo siras chamor achicha. I hear the Torah is telling me I shouldn't see my brother's donkey, my brother's ox, and say I'm not going to get involved. But, however, Parshas Mishpatim is here. When the Torah speaks about this earlier in the Torah and Sefer Shemos and Parshas Mishpatim, there it says he's bothered by the same thing. Ki sirach chamor sonacha. When I see the donkey of my enemy. So again, here we saw Oyivcha was in Mishpatim. He used a lashon of Oyivcha, but elsewhere he uses a lashon of Sonacha, your enemy. V'kan, here it's Chamor Achicha, your brother's donkey. What's the difference? What changed? So what happened in Parshas Mishpatim? The Torah says, yeah, even though it's my enemy's donkey, I still got to get involved. I still got to help. So he says as follows: this is teaching us something. Shimhaya Sonacha. The Torah was telling us Mishpatim, get over it. Even though he's your enemy, even though you're in an argument, I'm in an argument with that person about something, he's still a member of Klal Yisrael. He needs help. Get over it. Find a way to reclaim that sense of brotherhood and get involved and help. Linyan Hezer, to offer assistance, Shetakimimo, that you should assist him in helping that animal get off the ground. Shetishcha Chasina, and that'll enable me to get past that hatred. B'tizkor ha'ava, and focus on the love, focus on the fact that we're all part of one big family. So here's what he's doing, and I saw someone explain this so beautifully. What Rabbeinu Bachya is saying is as follows. Rabbeinu Bachya is saying a very different answer than the Meshech Chochmah. The Meshech Chochmah said there once was a time I was allowed to hate. Those days are done. It's all about love now. What the Rabbeinu Bachya is perhaps suggesting is by saying, get over that hate and love, is he's telling us, you know how I get over hate? I get over hate by exercising a degree of friendship. I know it's hard, but I'm going to exercise a degree of friendship. Once I exercise a degree of friendship, human psychology works. I can't act in a friendly manner to someone I hate. That's almost going to force me to start changing the way I feel about that person. I learned this week, I never heard of this before. There's something that psychologists refer to as the Ben Franklin effect. What's the Ben Franklin effect? Let me read to you 2 paragraphs. In his autobiography, Benjamin Franklin tells of a rival legislator with whom he was having trouble getting along. Franklin devised what may seem as counterintuitive plan to win him over. Knowing that this rival had a rare book in his library, Franklin sent him a message requesting the legislator lend him the book for a few days. Franklin returned the book with a thank you note a week later. Subsequently, the man who up to that point never spoke to Franklin treated him with great civility, and they kindled a friendship for the rest of their lives. The lesson from this story became known in psychological literature as the Ben Franklin effect. First studied in the 1960s, he gives us the name of 2 sociologists. The Ben Franklin effect demonstrates that a benefactor who does a favor for another person is likely to increase positive feelings towards the person he is benefiting, even if the benefactor originally did not like the other person. Something happens. As soon as we get involved in an act of chesed with another person, it's contagious. It's just like you got the snowball rolling, it's going to turn into a great big avalanche. You almost can't hold it back. That's the way human nature works. Listen to how he explains this. The hypothesized psychological concept underlying this phenomenon is cognitive dissonance. We tend to dislike having competing conceptions of ourselves in our minds, so we generally try and synthesize perceived differences. On the one hand, it doesn't make sense to help someone that I don't like. Yet on the other hand, I helped this person who I thought I didn't like. So how am I going to reconcile that? Hence, subconsciously, I resolved, it must be I really do like that person. And that's going to force me to say, okay, I got to reassess my relationship there. So perhaps that's what Rabbeinu Bachya is saying here. Rabbeinu Bachya perhaps might be saying the Ben Franklin effect before anyone knew to call it the Ben Franklin effect. In Mishpatim, he's speaking of the reality. The reality is this is an enemy. We've got beef. This is a Hatfield McCoy situation. But get involved. Do it anyhow. Get over it. Focus on that love. Focus on, in fact, one family. And what's going to happen by the time Parshas Seitzei rolls around and Sefer Devarim, now the Torah doesn't call him an enemy anymore. The Torah calls him Achicha. That's what happens. That's the Ben Franklin effect. I thought that's beautiful. I never heard of this concept, and here's Rabbeinu Bachya. It seems to be working with this hundreds and hundreds of years before Ben Franklin. But be that as it may, 2 very, very different Divrei Torah on the Parsha. One of them kind of morbid, but again, I just think it also brings us into a fascinating piece of modern Jewish history. And the second one, really, I think a useful tool for all of us, a tool to help us get over negative feelings we have about another person. It's counterintuitive, but if we really want to create a bond, create a friendship, start by doing a chesed. Once I do that, it's almost inevitable that achicha, that brotherly, sisterly relationship is going to kick in. So we want to get that ball rolling. And with that, I want to wish everyone a great day. I hope this can help each and every one of us utilize these sources to have a better understanding of the Parsha. I'm going to stop the recording,